Welcome back to Intro to Cultural Anthropology. I'm your teacher, Professor Leitner, and this week, of course, Chapter 7 is all about environmental anthropology, and I wanted to focus in on one of the key themes that the chapter keeps coming back to and several of our additional readings address, which is this phenomenon of climate change creating a situation where entire island nations are going to be sinking under the water, or rather the water is going to rise up above them. So let's talk about that a little bit. So as one example, I want to tell you about Tuvalu, which is a small island nation composed of 32 or 33 atolls and is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Tuvalu is the fourth smallest nation in the world. It has 11,000 people on 10 square miles of land. For comparison, the city of Alameda has a population of over 77,000 people and is on just 10.45 square miles of land. So there's a big difference there. It's quite a small island nation, or actually several islands. The largest island, Fangafale, is actually only 20 meters across at its narrowest point. So in other words, these islands are not huge. They're coral atolls, so they tend to be quite thin, and they tend to be quite exposed to the ocean. The UN Development Program classifies Tuvalu as both resource poor and having least developed status. Combining this with the fact that they are extremely vulnerable to climate change, we've got a sort of disaster waiting to happen here. So, climate and geography. The average altitude of um, Tuvalu is only about 3 meters above sea level, so it's only about 10 feet. Again, for comparison, Alameda, the island of Alameda, 33 feet. Sacramento is only 30 feet above sea level. Stockton is only 13 feet above sea level. Now, as we keep talking, imagine some of the effects that I'm talking about for these island nations happening in the Central Valley or to Alameda. Unlike those places, Tuvalu is surrounded by an open ocean. It gets battered from the east and the west when storms hit, and floods from storms and cyclones are very common. Climate change is making those storms stronger, and cyclones are both getting stronger and much more frequent. Scientists predict that the island nation of Tuvalu will be uninhabitable in 50 to 100 years, possibly even sooner. In terms of food, one of the main effects that rising sea levels has had on food production and consumption in Tuvalu and in many other island nations is that because the groundwater is getting contaminated by the rising seawater, they are much more vulnerable to droughts. And as climate change continues, droughts are much more common. The soil itself is growing saltier because of this increased salinity in the groundwater, and that is destroying some crops outright, whereas most other crops it's decreasing the size of the yields that people are getting. So in fact, actually, these islands are losing their food base. Dying coral is having an effect on not just the ecosystems that support fishing, because the organisms' habitats are disappearing, but also as the coral dies, they release these microalgae that can be toxic. When the fish eat these and then humans eat the fish, they can get what's called ciguatera poisoning. That is basically the fish have built up high levels of these toxins from eating the microalgae, and the humans get violently ill as a result. So the food supply itself, even the seafood supply, is being affected by climate change. Now, one of the things that we don't often think about when we talk about a changing climate is that changing climates can have serious health consequences for humans. In Tuvalu and other equatorial island nations, we are currently seeing an increase in cases of climate-related illness. So this includes increases in influenza, in instances of fungal diseases, conjunctivitis, and dengue fever. Dengue is a mosquito-borne illness that causes severe pain, and in some cases a fever, a very high fever that is accompanied by essentially your body's blood vessels leaking plasma everywhere inside of you. It's what's called a hemorrhagic fever, and this can be extremely deadly. High temperature related illnesses are also on the rise, so dehydration, heat stroke, and heat rashes. Now, there are many attempts to adapt going on right now. Kiribati is another island nation affected by sea level rise, and they have developed a number of different adaptations to this looming crisis. They have a program called Migration with Dignity, which has developed is working to develop a skilled labor force that can be sent abroad. So in other words, giving Kiribati people the skills they need to acquire work and live elsewhere because their homes are disappearing. Food security, of course, is an issue. As you lose land, you don't have anywhere to grow food. As the land you have becomes less and less arable, you need to find places for food. Kiribati has purchased 6,000 acres in Fiji in 2014 just for this purpose, for food security. There are engineering and reclamation efforts going on. People are building seawalls like the one you see here. There's also talk of building floating islands, so that is islands that aren't rooted to the seafloor and can rise or fall with the ocean. But ultimately, unless climate change reverses magically tomorrow, we are looking at a future where most of the inhabitants of these island nations are going to have to move. They are going to have to leave. International efforts have focused on migration and relocation for the most part. And unfortunately, this is often killing local beneficial projects like those seawalls and other things in the process. Why build these large projects if everybody's going to leave? Migration and relocation, though, come at a cost. People are losing their culture, their language in some cases, history, their knowledge of the landscape, and their identity. In Kiribati, 1 in 7 of the relocations that occur, whether those are between the islands or internationally, are due to the effects of severe climate change. These displaced people we call climate refugees. But unfortunately, climate refugee is not a clearly defined category in international law. It's not protected by treaties such as the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which means that the grounds for claiming refugee status are unclear at best. So we have displaced peoples who will not have the same rights under international law that people fleeing war and other kinds of natural disasters have. Finally, I want to leave you with some questions about how to connect what's happening on these islands with our own communities here. This is the question of environmental justice. Why are most of the worst effects of climate change happening to the poorest countries first? Will large countries like the US react differently to climate change as its effects begin affecting more Americans? What effect will mass migrations have on people's cultures in the future? And finally, sea level rise won't just affect Pacific Islands. Much of the San Francisco Bay could be underwater at high tide in the coming decades. Who is going to be the most affected by this? Or will the effects be felt evenly across society? If you want to try and find out some of those answers, there's some good local resources on the effects of climate change on sea level rise. I've included a couple of links in this PowerPoint, and I'll include them in the notes below. If you look at that image, though, of Emeryville, Alameda, and Oakland, you can see this is an assumption of a 55-inch increase in the normal high tide. And you can see just how much land will be underwater at high tide in the Bay Area. This includes a lot of poorer neighborhoods, but also a lot of neighborhoods that the city really depends on economically. Not that it doesn't depend on all the neighborhoods. So think about these questions as you're going through the chapter this week, and maybe jot some of your insights down in the discussions. Thanks a lot. Again, stay safe. I almost forgot. There's a bibliography for you here as well. I've drew most of my information from these sources. I'll try and start including these as much as I can in these slides.